Shalom, shalom, Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. Hope everyone's doing wonderful. Excited to learn some Sefer HaChinuch with you today. As always, feel free to post some questions or thoughts here below so that we can learn this together. And we're going to start in our preparation for Pesach looking at Matzah. Mitzvah number 10 in the 613 in the Taryag here in Sefer HaChinuch. Mitzvah number 10 is Mitzvat Achilat Matzah, the precept of eating matzah on Passover. So this is the mitzvah be'erev, on the evening of the 15th of Nisan, the month of Nisan, the first night of Pesach, the biblical mitzvah, because we learn here in Shmot, in Exodus 12:18, be'erev tochlu matzot, right, that at the evening you shall eat unleavened bread, it says in Exodus. Okay, now we see here the mitzvah also in 381, where it says, Mitzvat Pesach Sheni Sheyeachel al Matzot Umrorim. That actually, based on Shmot over here, Numbers 9:11, it says, Al Matzot Umrorim Yochluhu, that you should eat the matzah and the moror here on Pesach Sheni. And here it says that really with the moror we're talking about chazeret, about romaine lettuce, and that we also call this chasa, because it's remez bracha bo shechas rachmana aleinu. Right? There's a hint there within the word of chasa of a blessing of the merciful God who helps to take care of us. So what is this all about? This whole idea of matzah. So we say at the end of Magid, at the end of the storytelling at the Seder, we say based on Exodus 12:39 that our ancestors were thrust from Egypt and they didn't waste any time, and so we eat the matzah just like they did. That this matzah represents our urgent rush towards freedom. That we see an unjust society, we see people who are unfree, nations that are unfree, and the matzah is the reminder that the arc of history bends towards freedom. And that's not passive, but active. Our role as Klal Yisrael, as individuals, towards working for freedom. But also, this is halach ma'anya. This is the bread of poverty, the bread of affliction, right? It's not only the bread of freedom as it becomes in the Seder, but also it's a consciousness of our own inner aninut, our own inner poverty and affliction, where we're seeking freedom, but also collectively and nationally and globally, that we're yearning towards an era of freedom. And eating this matzah, we are actually eating this spiritual consciousness. We're eating a spiritual consciousness towards freedom. That we don't wish to be living in a system of conformity, in a rat race where we're stuck and we're in the same system each day where we're locked in, but rather we're yearning for a freedom, not a freedom from responsibility, but a freedom towards responsibility. And this matzah, we can't outsource it. We can't hire someone to eat the matzah for us, right? A lot of people of means want to hire someone to do everything for them, right? But we can't outsource this. You can't call room service for someone to eat your matzah for you, right? We have to do it. We have to feel it. And in fact, this is even more important for the maror, for the bitter herbs. It says in Pesachim 115b in the Talmud, Rava says, one who swallows their matzah without chewing, they fulfill the mitzvah. But one who swallows the maror without chewing, lo yatsa, they have not fulfilled the mitzvah. That it's true, we can fulfill the matzah simply by digesting it, right? But with the maror, we need to experience it. We need to experience the bitterness. So we say in the Haggadah, that Rabbi Gamliel used to say, whoever does not explain the following things at Pesach Seder has not fulfilled their duty, namely Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, right? That we have to tell the story of Pesach, Korban Pesach we learned about, and then we have to tell the story of Matzah, and we have to tell the story of Maror. Okay, now, to be excited for this, it's hard to get excited about matzah. Some people get excited. But to be excited, it says in Pesachim 99b, that on the afternoon before Pesach, one should not eat so that they're hungry, right? less, so one has an appetite for the matzah. There's a hiddur mitzvah. There's an enhancement of the mitzvah by not eating, so that we are excited about getting to the matzah. Okay, so what is this matzah all about? What is this all about? Now, more important than the answers, of course, are the questions. Pesach is all about cultivating wonder and questioning and awe in us, especially for children, right? More important than sitting, the leader of a Seder isn't supposed to sit up there with insight after insight, but rather create a space for questions where others can bring their questions and their insights as well. So the question on matzah is the question, right? The question is, what are we doing? Why are we eating this matzah? Right? We should ask those questions. Okay, so let's look at some insights. First from the Ramchal from Derech Hashem, in section 4, chapter 8, number 1, the Ramchal. And the Ramchal says over there that the purpose of matzah is to reduce the power of the Yetzer Hara, the Koach Yetzer Hara, right? Reduce the power of our negative inclination inside our psyche, inside of our gut, but rather we should move towards this Yetzer Hara that constantly desires Gashmius, that constantly desires the physical world, and we should move towards Ruchnius rather than the physicality, the materialism. We should move towards this spirituality. And then he says that the ikr of the, let me read the whole thing. He says that at a certain particular time, the Jews needed to refrain from chametz and to eat matzah in order to reduce the power of the Yetzer Hara, of the evil inclination, and the desire for the physical. This strengthens one's closeness to the spiritual, to ruchniut. It is impossible for a person to eat like this constantly, as this is not the goal in this world. However, for these specific days, it is appropriate to observe this concept, and through this, they will maintain an appropriate spiritual level. This is the main purpose of the festival of Matzah. And all of the other mitzvot of the first night are specific concept connected with the Geula, connected with this redemption. So we see here that Judaism, according to the Ramchal, is not ascetic. We don't deny pleasure, we don't deny the material. But on Pesach itself, we do want to enhance this experience of clinging to the spiritual over the physical, right? And I would argue today, people say, what's the biggest threat to the Jews? Is it Iran? Is it assimilation or anti-Semitism? Say the biggest threat to the Jews in the 21st century is materialism. That we are consumed with buying stuff, making stuff, working much more than we need to acquire much more wealth than we need, right? Buying on Amazon, shopping all the time, right? Obsessed with stuff, with hedonism, with desire for pleasure. I don't want to overstate this, but I think it's part of the zeitgeist of our time. And so the matzah is there to swing us the other way. The matzah is there to remind us that the true gifts of our existence are the spiritual components found in relationships to human beings we love, found in our relationship to God, found in the actualization of our values. So that's the Ramchal. The Ramchal says the matzah, because it's not cake, it's not challah, right? It's not, doesn't taste bad, but it's intentionally not tasting good. It's true we might add things to it later to make it taste good, but we want to eat something that is unspiced, unflavored, unleavened, to remind ourselves the power of consumption, that we are what we eat. We are the values of what we consume. Now the Maharal in Gevuras Hashem, chapter 60, says something different. He says the Arba Kosot, the 4 cups of wine or grape juice, represent our spiritual redemption, whereas the matzah represents our physical redemption. These 2 different components. One level to geula in the world, one level to achieving freedom is physical freedom. You get paid more for your hours of work. You get out of the prisons. You get freedom through legislation, right? You get out of the abusive relationship, right? We get out of the pain and the suffering of a sickness or an illness. The freedom that is physical, right? And the reality of that physical freedom. And then there's another type of freedom, which is, of course, spiritual. We often think about this as the journey from Pesach to Shavuot. That Pesach is freedom from, here we're channeling Isaiah Berlin on liberties. Pesach is freedom from, and Shavuot is freedom to, right? We're not freedom, right? Judaism is not merely about getting free from the things we don't want, but rather it's about being free to actualize our values, free to actualize the Torah mandates of what we can do in the world. And that is Shavuos, that is Shavuot. So the Maharal says here, when we drink the wine, it's freedom too. We're moving towards spiritual redemption. And the matzah is physical freedom. We don't choose one or the over the other. We know Jewishly, Rav Kook explains this really nicely, that we have to be focused on the physical freedom of others first, before the spiritual freedom. That we work not towards of giving others spirituality, work towards their physical freedom in order that a greater spiritual freedom can come out of that. And that's why Pesach, of course, precedes Shavuot. We don't receive the Torah and our moral mission before our freedom from Mitzrayim, from Egypt. Rather, we are free, and then we go to find our mission once we achieve this type of freedom. As Rav Yisrael Salanter said so nicely, that another person's physical needs are the fulfillment of my spiritual needs. My goal is not to just proselytize others towards some spiritual truth, but rather to lighten someone else's load physically. And that is my spiritual mandate itself. So the pace of change happens differently. Physical change can happen very quickly, right? From physically, we have a surgery and it's done, or we get pain relief and the pain is gone, or we leave Egypt very quickly and the physical freedom happens. But spiritual, intellectual freedom takes much longer. We leave Egypt quickly, but then we're in the desert for 40 years. 40 years, and the Rambam says, Maimonides says, we needed the slave mentality to die out. We needed to be there for 40 years, because you can't have sovereignty built upon a slave mentality. The slave generation needed to die out. And so we learn here that physical freedom happens quickly from Egypt, but spiritual and intellectual freedom, you need the 40 years of the desert to make that transition. Now, Rav Kook in the Shmona Kvatzim, chapter 5, section 100, explains that, of course, the first Ashkenazic chief rabbi of pre-state Israel, he says that nations in general are more chained than individuals. This is an interesting insight. There's many benefits to the nation state, but one of the losses to collectives in general, whether it's an empire or nation state, is that in the system, people are more confined than they are within their own individual confines. And so there's this burden put upon groups. But Israel was raised to freedom towards Cherut when we had Yetziat Mitzrayim, when we left Egypt, and the nation was then designated to perfect the world, Rav Kook says. That our job was the liberation of the will, the freedom of the character, and to do tikkun olam, to repair the world, Rav Kook says. That it's true that normally an individual can have free will, but a nation is not entirely free. Certainly not the individual within the system of the nation. But Rav Kook says the secret of the matzah, the secret that is laden within the power of eating the matzah, is that we find the power of freedom, sacred freedom, holy freedom, found within the matzah. That the matzah might feel like it is a reminder of slavery, of poverty, of affliction, but actually hidden within the power of the matzah is the potential we have to actualize our freedom and to actualize freedom in the world. Okay, the last two thoughts here. First, we have the Kozhnitzer Magid. The Kozhnitzer Magid says something beautiful about yachatz. Yachatz, when we break the matzahs to remind ourselves of the brokenness in the world. And the Kozhnitzer Magid says, the world is so broken, but our children could make the world whole again. We may become cynical over time because we see how difficult change is. But our children hold on to the idealism. Our children are the dreamers. So he says the world is so broken, but our children can make the world whole again. We break the matzah. The small pieces we keep, and the big piece, the big brokenness, our children take away. Then they bring it back to us whole to serve as the afikomen at the end of the Seder. Our children, the Koznitzer Maggid says, they are the ones that are taking this brokenness away from us. That we actually have our children as the teachers, the Koznitzer Maggid says, that they take the brokenness away from us. So it's true, we highlight the value of experience. We love experience, the wisdom of experience that elders hold. And yet we need the youth who hold on to the dreams, who can hold on to the brokenness because they're dreamers for us. Now here's the last point on Matzah today. The last point on Matzah today comes from the great founder of the Musar tradition, the founder of Musar, the great ethical and spiritual development movement out of Lithuania, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. And Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was invited to inspect the matzah factory to see if the matzah was all kosher. And he spent hours walking around the matzah factory. And as he walked around, he inspected everything very closely. And the owner of the matzah factory said, Rav Yisrael, will you give us your hashgacha now? Will you give us the kosher certification to demonstrate that this is kosher matzah for our city and exporting beyond the city? And Rav Yisrael Salanter said, no, I won't. I won't certify this matzah factory. And the owner said, what did we do wrong? Excuse me. There were no non-kosher ingredients brought in. Rabbi Salanter said, you're right. The owner said, we didn't bake anything too long. We didn't keep the water mixed with the wheat for too long. Nothing unkosher. Everything is kosher the Pesach. Rav Yisrael Salanter said, you're right. So the owner said, what's the problem? Why won't you give hashgacha? Why won't you give kosher certification to our matzah? Rav Yisrael Salanter banged the table and he said, did you see the women in the back room? You've been working them all day and all night and haven't given them a break and there's blood on their fingertips. You've worked them too hard. This matzah is not kosher. It has to not only be kosher, but also yosher, the Rav Yisrael Salanter said. And this is an important reminder that lest we feel just righteous eating our matzah, we should remember the worker treatment behind it, both from the factories and within our own homes, of who is preparing in our own homes the food, who is cleaning in our own homes. And the matzah is the consciousness, not only historically, of the oppressions and the injustice that happens in the world, but the matzah, while it's not puffed up, it's not leavened, in fact, it expands us. It's not leavened on the outside, but when we eat it, it expands our moral and spiritual consciousness to see the invisible people in society, to see the brokenness in the world, to see the hidden dimensions in the world that we might be missing, right? Because we learn that tikkun olam comes from tikkun he'elem. Not repairing the world is about repairing the hiddenness, the hidden dimensions. And the matzah is there to do that for us. That we sit there at the Seder eating the matzah that's not puffed up in order that it puffs up our spiritual and intellectual consciousness towards seeing the world more deeply. The matzah represents our urgent rush to freedom. May we all have the bracha this Pesach of preparing and being ready for Pesach, so that when we embrace the matzah, when we chew it, or as the Talmud says, just swallow it, it expands our awareness of suffering in the world, but also of the potential we have to actualize freedom, to emulate the divine, to bring freedom into the world. Have a wonderful day.